What is happening in Palestine? This is one burning question in the minds of the people even during the unprecedented times of a pandemic. To be precise, Palestine is located in Israel. However, it covers only the state of Palestine that is part of the Western Bank and Gaza Strip. Some parts of Western Bank area do belong to Israelis and the Gaza Strip is under the control of Palestine. Now, you can understand how both the countries coexist in terms of the geography. There is another piece of land you must know, which is Jerusalem, the holy place for Christians, Muslims and Jews. Israelis live in West Jerusalem, while East Jerusalem has more Palestinians. But Israelis think that the entire Jerusalem should belong to them. For many years, dozens of Palestinian families are living in the East Jerusalem area. And the Israeli Jews are stealing the homes of the Palestinian Muslim residents and evicting them out of their own homes. But is it really what it seems like? Is there any history behind this? Is this a conflict or just another game of oppression? Do the people of Palestine deserve to be treated this way? And what is the reason behind the Israeli Jews becoming violent on Palestinians? In today's video, let's look at the facts and history. It all began at the beginning of Ramadan. The Israeli police officials placed barriers outside the old city's Damascus Gate, which is the holy gathering place for the Muslims for performing their evening prayers during the month of Ramadan. Later, the barriers were removed. However, the Israelis started protesting against the residing Palestinian families in the east of Jerusalem from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and threatened to evict them from their own homes. Not just one or two families, but dozens of them. The court asked around 50 people to evacuate by May 2nd, and around 70 of the neighborhood's residents will face eviction this August. In October of 2020, an Israeli district court in Jerusalem ruled that at least 12 Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of occupied East Jerusalem must give up their homes for Israeli settlers to take over as well as pay for their expenses. To this movement, the Palestinian families retorted with a non-violent protest to safeguard their position in their houses, but this acted against them. But the peaceful protest was broken by the Israelis, and the Israeli police came into action, started attacking these protesters violently. Not just this, they invaded Palestinian houses and started arresting them as well. The attack did not stop here. They took this one step forward and attacked the Muslims in the Al-Aqsa Mosque while they were offering prayers by shooting them with rubber bullets, throwing grenades and using tear gas. As of now, the numbers are not clear, but many were injured and taken to the hospital. The horror followed these victims into the hospital building, where the Israeli authorities attacked the hospital staff so that they could not treat the injured Palestinians. Taking a look at the present timelines of current events, the death toll in Gaza has reached 140, which includes 49 children. Almost 600 people have been injured during this combat. Israel continues to bombard the Gaza Strip with aerial attacks. Even after repeated calls for calm from the United Nations, Israel is gearing up at the Gaza Strip border with artillery shells. Palestinian homes in the West Bank are attacked. New Israeli strikes have been reported to hit northern Gaza. Various clashes have been reported in the West Bank. Rockets fired in Gaza hits buildings in Israel's Ashkelon. Israeli forces' attack on northern Gaza resulted in hundreds of people losing their homes. The Jewish settlers issue isn't from now. The Palestinian families have been facing these issues for a long time and have been fighting a long legal battle against the Jews who seek to acquire a property in the crowded Palestinian neighborhood outside the old city. Many people have regarded this matter as an internal affair, while some have given it a religious point of view as a clash of Jerusalem. There have been a series of shootings in the West Bank that have increased the tension between the two sects. So, is this a religious issue or there is more to it? Have Israelis and Palestinians always been fighting, or is this the first time? What is the history behind this? How exactly did this originate? Let's answer all of these questions carefully. It was not always blood and war. There was a time when both the countries lived in harmony and peacefully. But this was not going to last for long after the British withdrew their authority over Palestine in the year of 1949. This is when Israel declared itself as an independent country and was opposed by Palestine and other neighboring Arab countries, which then gave birth to the conflict of Israel and Palestine with the 1948 Arab-Israel War. This was the beginning of their fight, which has been going on ever since. Between 1948 to 2021, there have been several violent attacks that have marked a scar in the hearts of the people. Let's look at some historical timelines. 1948. A regional conflict grows amid the end of the British mandate for Palestine and Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948. In the end, Israel controls a large portion of its territory. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flee or are driven from their land. 1958. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital trade route connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. Israel invades Egypt, followed by forces from Britain and France. A peace deal backed by the United States and the Soviet Union ends the fighting, but the canal was blocked by sunken ships and did not reopen until 1957. 1967. The Six-Day War begins with Israeli warplanes striking Egyptian airfields and Israeli ground forces entering the Sinai Peninsula. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians flee or are displaced. 1973. A coalition of Arab nations led by Egypt and Syria launches a surprise attack on Israel. The Arab forces initially gained ground but were driven back by an Israeli counter-offensive aided by supplies from allies including the United States. 1978. A peace deal between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, known as the Camp David Accords, is brokered on September 17, 1978 by President Jimmy Carter. Potential Palestinian peace proposals were discussed but never carried out. 2000. The Second Intifada, a Palestinian uprising, begins after riots broke out following a visit by right-wing Israeli political figure Ariel Sharon and later the Prime Minister to a compound in Jerusalem venerated in Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Clashes and other violence continued until 2005, leaving hundreds dead on both sides. 2008. Israel begins 3 weeks of attacks on Gaza after rocket barrages into Israel by Palestinian militants who are supplied by tunnels from Egypt. More than 1,110 Palestinians and at least 13 Israelis were killed. 2012. Israel kills Hamas military chief Ahmad Jabari, touching off more than a week of rocket fire from Gaza and Israeli airstrikes. At least 150 Palestinians and 6 Israelis were killed. 2014. Hamas militants kill 3 Israeli teenagers kidnapped near a Jewish settlement in the West Bank, prompting an Israeli military response. Hamas answers with rocket attacks from Gaza. A 7-week conflict leaves more than 2,200 Palestinians dead in Gaza. In Israel, 67 soldiers and 6 civilians were killed. 2017. The Trump administration recognizes Jerusalem as a capital of Israel and announces that it plans to shift the US embassy from Tel Aviv, stirring outrage from Palestinians. 2018. Protests take place in Gaza along the fence with Israel, including demonstrators hurling rocks and gasoline bombs across the barrier. Israeli troops kill more than 170 protesters over several months. In November, Israel staged a covert raid into Gaza. At least 7 suspected Palestinian militants and a senior Israeli army officer were killed. From Gaza, hundreds of rockets are fired into Israel. If you have an eye for detail, you will notice a pattern here. History has it. Israel has tended to torment Palestinians and engage in violent actions since the beginning of time. The level of severity has been increasing with every attack, and this time it has crossed every other year's record. This has to be the most severe clash. However, the current situation of the so-called Israeli-Palestine conflict is raising a lot of questions based on what is being portrayed to us. With the history being led, the villains are very clear to us. However, never judge a book by its cover. Before you jump into any conclusions, let's understand the situation from a deep end, uncover some facts, and bust these myths to make our concepts clear and not fall prey to any misinformation. Busting myths. Myth 1. Palestine and Israel are in conflict. Fact. What is happening in Palestine is nothing but settler colonialism, military occupation, land theft, and ethnic cleansing. A conflict will mean there is equal say, action, and footing. However, that's not true in this case. There is an active oppressor, which is Israel, and the oppressed, which is Palestine. This is no longer a conflict, but a clear case of social domination, injustice, and oppression. Myth 2. Palestine was a desert. Israel made this desert green. The fact is, before the occupation of Israel, Palestine had rich, green, lush land. Palestine respected the biodiversity of its indigenous land. They were producing 92% of Palestine's grain, 99% of its olives, 95% of its melons to sustain themselves well in green. After Israel came in, biodiversity has decreased. Israel removed indigenous plants from the land to plant European invasive species. This phenomenon is called green colonialism. Myth number 3. Sheikh Jarrah is the only neighborhood in Palestine that is in danger. The fact is, over a period, Israel has been stealing Palestinian land, destroying ethnically cleansing entire Palestinian villages, violently displacing families, and building illegal settlements on top of them since the first catastrophe in 1948, where almost 600 Palestinian villages were destroyed. This erased half of their population and made them homeless, wiping off the majority of Palestinians from history. In the last few decades, the state of Israel has continued the settler colonial project, and Sheikh Jarrah is the latest and not the last neighborhood being violently threatened with dispossession, which Israel has no legal right to do so. Our point: we need to understand myths and facts clearly. This is not a two-sided conflict framing Palestinian resistance as terrorism and normalizing the state of Israel. Is killing people, attacking them, and evicting them from their own homes normal? Is banishing them from their religious gatherings and entering a pious space with arms and ammunition acceptable? Let's look at the current situation. Palestinian civilians are currently suffering in great numbers in Jerusalem, Gaza, and West Bank due to Israeli forces. The New York Times reported that the most of the deaths so far have occurred in Gaza. We want to highlight the humanitarian crisis in Palestine because, while there has been fighting in the region for decades, recent escalations have seen a catastrophic loss of Palestinian lives. Despite a long-term peace process, Israelis and Palestinians have failed to reach a final peace agreement. Progress was made towards a two-state resolution with 1993 to 1995 Oslo Accords, but today the Palestinians remain subject to Israeli military occupation in the Gaza Strip and 165 islands across the West Bank. Total casualties for this period: 63,543, including 31,227 fatalities. Jewish settlers claim that the land belongs to them and want to expand settlements to the whole of East Jerusalem, where Palestinians live. Under international law, Israeli settlements are deemed illegal and are widely denounced. Mona Al-Kurd, a Palestinian woman, was captured saying in a video widely circulated online where she confronts an Israeli settler occupying her house.
So we won't leave. I always say when anyone asks me this question, I will tie myself inside my house, and if they wanna take my house, they should force me to leave. No one can leave the house that they was born in and live in and have his whole life in. No one. So me, my family, and all the neighborhood won't leave this land.
The United Nations also said in March that it is concerned at any efforts to change the demographic composition of these areas. It has made those concerns transparent and will stay firm on that position by following the issue at the UN Security Council. Human rights organizations also condemned forced evacuations. Jewish Voice for Peace, an Israeli human rights organization, has declared its support for Palestinian families. The best way to address these concerns while promoting learning and action is to take time to listen to Palestinians and Israelis. To understand how Israelis and Palestinians are impacted by violence and human rights violations today. Various nations have come forward putting forth a word of concern and offered a helping hand for Palestine. The UN Secretary General on Friday issued an urgent appeal for all parties involved in this week's escalation of violence in the occupied Palestinian enclave of Gaza and Israel to immediately cease the fighting or risk creating an uncontainable security and humanitarian crisis. As nations, the best you can do is spread awareness and educate people about the current situation in Palestine so that the matter is taken into control and ceases to exist. There has been a huge loss of lives, and clearly many innocent people are suffering amidst this crisis. Nations and individuals should come forward and offer help and support during this crisis.